Good morning. Today's scripture passage comes from Luke chapter 24, verses 13 through 35. That same day, two of Jesus' followers were walking to the village of Emmaus, 7 miles from Jerusalem. As they walked along, they were talking about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things, Jesus himself suddenly came and began walking with them. But God kept them from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing so intently as you walk along?" They stopped short, sadness written across their faces. Then one of them, Cleopas, replied, "You must be the only person in Jerusalem who hasn't heard about all the things that happened there the last few days." "What things?" Jesus asked. "The things that happened to Jesus, the man from Nazareth," they said. "He was a prophet who did powerful miracles, and he was a mighty teacher in the eyes of God and all the people. But our leading priests and other religious leaders handed him over to be condemned to death, and they crucified him. We had hoped he was the Messiah who had come to rescue Israel. This all happened 3 days ago. Then some women from our group of his followers were at his tomb early this morning, and they came back with an amazing report. They said his body was missing, and they had seen angels who told them Jesus is alive. Some of our men ran out to see, and sure enough, his body was gone, just as the women had said. Then Jesus said to them, 'You foolish people, you find it so hard to believe all that the prophets wrote in the scriptures. Wasn't it clearly predicted that the Messiah would have to suffer all these things before entering his glory?' Then Jesus took them through the writings of Moses and all the prophets, explaining from all the scriptures the things concerning himself. By this time they were nearing Emmaus and the end of their journey. Jesus acted as if he was going on, but they begged him, 'Stay the night with us, since it is getting late.' So he went home with them. As they sat down to eat, he took the bread and blessed it. Then he broke it and gave it to them. Suddenly their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and at that moment he disappeared. They said to each other, 'Didn't our hearts burn within us as he talked with us along the road and explained the scriptures to us?' And within the hour they were on their way back to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 disciples and others who were gathered with them, who said, 'The Lord has really risen. He appeared to Peter.' Then the two from Emmaus told their story of how Jesus had appeared to them as they were walking along the road, and how they had recognized him as he was breaking the bread. This is the gospel of Jesus Christ. Thanks be to God.
Peekaboo! Peekaboo!
Where's Kira? Where's Kira? Peekaboo!
Peekaboo. There is just something about this simple game that brings so much joy to little kids worldwide. When we play, there is a shared experience of joy in both the child and the one peekabooing, because it isn't only the child who receives the joy. May you seek to share in joy with one another this week. The joy of knowing and experiencing the good news, just as the disciples first experienced it. Blessings to all.
My sons love it when I tell stories about my childhood to them. Usually these stories have to do with how difficult my life was when I was growing up compared to theirs now. Like last week, how I said we had all of 3 or 4 channels to choose from on TV, and how we had to get up off the couch if we wanted to change the channel. Or how when I was a boy, we had phones that were connected to the wall. Picture that, our phones were actually permanently attached to the wall, and we had to actually dial a phone number using our fingers. And all the phones had these cords attached to them that limited you on where you could talk on the phone. One time my family sprung for one of those phone cords that were really, really long, something like 10 feet long. Talk about freedom. This now allowed us to talk on the phone in the living room as opposed to the kitchen where the phone was located. Of course, these long cords were a tripping hazard. And don't even get me started on rotary phones. It would take 5 minutes to dial a long distance phone number, which costs extra, by the way. Kids, ask your parents what a rotary phone was. This got me reminiscing. This is what happens when you've been in quarantine for too long. It got me reminiscing about one of my favorite things to do when I was a kid, those hidden picture puzzles. Do y'all remember those? Hidden pictures started appearing in the Highlights magazine. Again, for you youngsters, ask your parents what a magazine was. They started appearing back in 1946. We didn't have a subscription to Highlights, so the only time I got to do them was when I went to the dentist. But I can still remember how disappointed I would be if I turned to the hidden pictures puzzle only to discover that some jerk had already circled all of the pictures. Anyway, you can find these hidden picture puzzles now online. But for those of you who do not know what a hidden picture puzzle was, it was a large picture into which the artist hid smaller images. A baseball cap, a toothbrush, scissors, a mitten, a paperclip, etc. And you were given a diagram of what these little pictures looked like, and your task was to find them all. Sometimes you had to look pretty hard to see them, and other times they were quite obvious. I couldn't help but be reminded of the hidden picture puzzles when I read this scripture passage of the story of the walk to Emmaus. Sometimes we don't recognize things for what they are, even if they are right under our noses. Sometimes we don't recognize things for what they are, even if they are right under our noses. Such was the case for the two disciples in our story for today. Here were two disciples, only one of whom is actually named, walking along and talking with Jesus for miles, but they did not recognize him, at least not completely. It wasn't until Jesus broke the bread that their eyes were opened. But when they looked back at their walk, they both realized that their hearts were burning within them as a stranger opened the scriptures up to them. Sometimes Jesus is right in front of our faces, and yet we don't even recognize him. This has been very true recently. In the midst of this pandemic, Jesus can be seen everywhere, if only we have the eyes to see him. That's what I want to focus on today. This is another great retelling of a resurrection appearance. This one is unique to Luke, and it happens on the day of the resurrection. Two disciples are walking along the road on their way to a small village called Emmaus. We only know the name of one of the disciples, Cleopas. This is the one and only time he is ever mentioned in the scriptures. We don't know why they are going there. Perhaps it was their hometown. Emmaus is only about 7 miles from Jerusalem. As they were walking along, they were trying to make sense of all that had happened when a mysterious stranger suddenly joins them. The stranger is Jesus. But for some reason, God, we are told, keeps them from recognizing Jesus. Jesus asks what they have been talking about so earnestly. And they look at him with a look of exasperation. They tell him he must be the only person coming from the direction of Jerusalem who hasn't heard all about what went on there these last couple of days. Jesus faced them by asking, what things? Apparently he wants to hear their version of what happened. They proceed to tell this stranger about Jesus, whom they had hoped was the Messiah. But apparently they were wrong, because he had been arrested and crucified by the religious and political authorities. But then, to complicate matters, some of the women from their group went to the tomb this morning only to come back with an amazing, substitute the word unbelievable for amazing, report that Jesus was not in the tomb and that an angel had appeared to them telling them that he had risen from the dead and is alive. Luke tells us that when the women came back and told the rest of the disciples about their experience, that none of the disciples believed them. Luke's exact words are, the story sounded like nonsense, so they didn't believe it. And these two are no different. You can tell that they didn't believe the women's report because they are still wallowing in grief. Jesus takes it upon himself to teach these disciples everything that is written about him in the Hebrew Scriptures, and how the Messiah, rather than being a victorious, militaristic figure, was instead destined to die on the cross before he could enter into his glory. Wouldn't you have loved to be in on that Bible study? When they finally reached Emmaus, this mysterious stranger appears as if he's going to continue his journey. But the two disciples beg him to stay with them. He accepts their offer, and during dinner, Jesus plays host as he takes the bread, blesses it, and breaks it, and gives it to the two disciples. It's at this point that they finally recognize who this stranger is, and immediately, Jesus disappears. Poof, he's gone. Talk about a plot twist. The two disciples are left with their mouths gaping open. When they start talking about their journey from Jerusalem to Emmaus, they realize that all the while Jesus was opening up the Scriptures to them, that their hearts were burning inside of them with excitement. So immediately they decide to head back to Jerusalem. And they must have made pretty good time, because they find the rest of the disciples still up and in a state of an excitement. And in the biggest example of stealing someone else's thunder ever, before they could tell anyone about their experience, the rest of the disciples say to them, "The Lord has really risen. He appeared to Peter." A story, by the way, that Luke omits from his gospel. The two disciples then proceed to tell the others about their encounter with the risen Christ and of how he was made known to them in the breaking of the bread. This story reminds me that Jesus is present with us always, and yet we often have difficulty recognizing him. Jesus is present with us always, and yet we often have difficulty recognizing him. This has been true throughout this stay home, stay safe order. As I look around at the stories that are unfolding and emerging around this pandemic, I see evidence of Jesus everywhere I look. Take those who are essential workers, for example. Jesus said there is no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends. I see Jesus in the sacrificial service of those that continue to go to work in the midst of this pandemic. I see Jesus in the sacrificial service of those that continue to go to work in the midst of this pandemic. Every day, some people have to put their own health at risk to serve the needs of others. Some healthcare workers, grocery store employees, food processing employees, first responders, transit drivers, etc., have all made the ultimate sacrifice of laying down their lives, not only for their friends, but for complete strangers. One such worker was ER Dr. Frank Gabrin. Even though he didn't have adequate personal protective equipment and was having to reuse the same mask for 4 or more days, he continued to go to work every day at either St. John's Episcopal or East Orange General Hospitals in New Jersey. He went in even though he was in the high-risk category, being over 60 years of age and with previous health challenges that left him with a compromised immune system. Dr. Frank Gabrin was the first ER doctor in the United States to die from COVID-19 on March 31st. He was certain he caught the virus because of the lack of PPEs available to him. Now, if this doesn't remind you of Jesus, then you need to open your eyes. I see Jesus everywhere I look in the sacrifices people are making for friends and family, and even for perfect strangers. I have also seen Jesus in the outpouring of love and kindness, oftentimes again from complete strangers. I have seen Jesus in the outpouring of love and kindness, oftentimes again from complete strangers. One person I have grown to admire very much in this crisis is actor John Krasinski. John Krasinski started a YouTube channel called SGN, short for Some Good News. If you haven't checked it out, you should, after you finish watching our worship offering, that is. The premise of this show is simple. John thought that there was so much bad news out there having to do with the coronavirus that he thought people could use some good news as well. And so he's done about 4 broadcasts where he has lifted up the many wonderful things that are being done by people out there everywhere. And sometimes he has taken matters into his own hands. For one little girl who was crushed when her family's planned outing to the musical Hamilton was canceled, John organized the original and current cast members of the Broadway show, including Lin-Manuel Miranda, the show's creator, to sing the opening song from the musical just for her. It was an amazing production. 20 or so different performers seamlessly put together in an effort to cheer up one little girl. And on the last episode of SGN, John organized a nationwide prom for all the high school seniors who had missed out on theirs. He brought in Chance the Rapper, the Jonas Brothers, and Billie Eilish. For you older listeners, ask your kids and grandkids who they are. He brought them all in to perform while seniors all around the country zoomed in and danced and partied on. Another example of someone showing the love and kindness of Jesus comes from the actor Tyler Perry. Out of concern for people who are struggling to make ends meet, Tyler Perry paid for an entire day of groceries for anyone who came into a particular Walmart on a particular day. And then last week, the global concert, One World, organized by Lady Gaga, was held. It featured many different performers filming videos from their homes. All the proceeds raised went to help fight the pandemic. All total, they raised $127 million. But it's not just famous people who are showing love and kindness. There are restaurant owners who have been sending meals to healthcare workers. There have been drive-by birthday wishes for children and adults alike who have had to celebrate their birthdays while social distancing. There have been neighbors checking in with their neighbors and bringing them food and other necessities as needed. Everywhere I look, I see the love and kindness of Jesus being lived out. And so everywhere I look, I see Jesus. Everywhere I look, I see the love and kindness of Jesus being lived out. And so everywhere I look, I see Jesus. Those 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus did not recognize Jesus at first, even though their hearts were strangely warm, to use a phrase from John Wesley, while Jesus opened the scriptures to them. But they ultimately recognized Jesus in the breaking of the bread. Jesus is still very active in our daily lives, especially in the midst of this pandemic. And we too can recognize him if we just open our eyes. Jesus is still very active in our lives, especially in the midst of this pandemic, and we too can recognize him if only we just open our eyes. Jesus is made known to us through the sacrifice of others, something that Jesus has done for all of us. And Jesus is made known to us through acts of love and kindness that are being shared everywhere we look. So keep your eyes peeled for Jesus. Like those hidden pictures puzzles, sometimes he's easy to spot, and other times it's not as obvious at first. But I believe that when we get to the other side of this pandemic, and we do take a look back upon this very difficult season we are passing through, that we'll see the undeniable presence of Jesus through it all. Stay safe and well, and thanks for listening.